What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are finally here with G.O.D.S by Jonathan Hickman, where he, over the course of the next 8 months, is going to be rewriting the entirety of the Marvel cosmic landscape, the cosmic entities, gods, the whole 9 yards. And what this does is this picks up at what's basically a party of sorts, right? Kind of a get-together with all these people wearing different masks, and somebody's wearing a mask that makes them look like Spider-Man. And there's these hosts, right? They kind of welcome everybody to this place, right? Welcome users of the craft. You have passed your first trial, the secret words which begat the hidden path. And so now it's just kind of like, enjoy yourselves, right? Be carnal, enjoy your, physical delights. Basically, go find a room and bang if you want to. But that's when we're met by the arrival of a guy named Winn. Now, Winn is a wholly new creation in Marvel Comics, and in the events leading up to G.O.D.S and the teasers behind what was going on with it, a lot of people thought it was the return of Clyde Wincham, which would have been dope. Clyde Wincham is the Marquis of Death, dude's ridiculously OP. But the thing about this is Winn is like a wholly new guy. We will learn about him, but when he shows up here along with the guy that's with him, they're not wearing any masks. And so it's kind of like, how in the world did you get in here? Because the only people who can access this place are people who are wearing masks. However, do not fret, we have masks that you can purchase for a price, although it's not really worth discussing what the price is. For those of you guys who are familiar with Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, no, it's not the Sinners Market, but it would be dope if it was. I loved the Sinners Market and Avengers and New Avengers. It's one of the coolest concepts in the history of Marvel Comics, but something dope will show up here. And so what ends up happening is we get this kind of explanation, right? The blonde guy, his name is Dimitri, and as he explains, he says, I am a proxy in service to the natural order of things and the chained apprentice of the one and only avatar of the powers that be. Now, that's one of the things to understand here, and it's kind of a new creation by Hickman. The natural order of things and the powers that be, they're basically two rivaling factions, but the idea here is they still serve the traditional cosmic entities that we know: eternity, infinity, the living tribunal, that kind of thing. Exactly how far-reaching they go and what their interaction with those cosmic entities are, we don't fully know, and we'll find out, I'm sure, over the course of this, although there will be a pretty dope reference. God, there's so much cool stuff that happens in this comic. So what ends up happening is they figure out pretty fast this whole thing is a ruse, right? And there's kind of like a little computerized device they have that basically grants them information that they wouldn't normally be able to access on their own, that kind of thing. And what we're basically told by way of this device is that these are two beings who are effectively masquerading. It's a great big huge ruse here. They're the Baron and Baroness of Wolverhampton, Lord of the Land and Lady of the Lake. And it says these are titles they hold in absentia as they abandoned their seat of power years ago. They're currently visiting these fair lands indefinitely, and according to their visas, with surgical dispensation. In essence, her name is Nimue de Locke, which I think is how you pronounce that, and he's the Lion of Wolves. Once they're forced to remove their masks, we end up finding out what the nature of this whole ruse is, which is that, in effect, they basically lure people here. They are people that do have some measure of magical abilities, but they lure people to these grand parties, putting on this air that it's a place where those who practice witchcraft and magic and so on and so forth can hang out. But none of them are legitimate. They're probably just general practitioners of magic, right? Like card tricks, people who work in Las Vegas, right? Just simple magic tricks, guys like David Blaine. But what they do is when they bring them here, they end up picking basically somebody or a few people and they consume them. They literally eat them. Right now, more or less they eat their bodies, but they also consume their souls. And so the result of this is that they're not supposed to be here, right? And so in essence, like the question that's asked is really like, why is Winn here in the first place? Why would a guy of his level of power be brought to a place where some folks are hoodwinking people and then consuming their flesh and their souls? And he's told it's because there's a demon here that's not supposed to be here. And in fact, it's actually residing in the bathroom. And so once he gets there, he basically faces off against this thing. Now, it is not like the most significant moment ever, but it does go towards establishing him. More so than that, we're told that this demon is chaotic in nature. In effect, it seems to stem from like the Flickering Realms, the land of Chthon, powered by chaos magic. We're not explicitly told that, but the fact that it's chaotic in nature really seems to lend itself towards that. The other part of this is that because of the mannerisms and the way in which Winn talks, a lot of you guys who are DC fans, and particularly Vertigo fans, will pick up on the fact this guy is very similar to John Constantine, which is not the worst thing. Ultimately, they defeat this demon, and then that's basically it. And then they end up traveling to a bar where Wynn goes in and Dimitri's made to wait outside. This is where we get this really huge kind of like drop in information on what's going on. It's not the huge explosive part, things haven't popped off yet, but it is cool for information. And the reason why is because what we end up finding out here is this guy Wynn is Sir Redwyn, Lord of the Highlands, root of the world tree, salt of the earth. That he, as far as this woman's records show, is the avatar of the powers that be. Now, the reason why this matters is because this woman's name is Aiko, A-I-K-O, and her and Wynn are lovers. The problem with this is that it's very much a kind of Romeo and Juliet story. Not insofar as like all the romance and they end each other's lives and so on and so forth, or in their own lives or what have you, but in the sense that they are paired with the opposing factions. He is a representative of the powers that be, but she works for the natural order of things. She didn't fully understand what she was getting into when she was brought into, quote unquote, the organization. So that seems to indicate that the natural order of things stretches everywhere from just normal corporations on Earth out to the cosmic entities and so on and so forth. Again, it's very cloak and dagger and very mysterious, but in essence, she's been offered a position that is incredibly high ranking within the top 100, right? Like the last prime of the Centum, which is kind of like their inner circle, if we had to go that route, right? Like the most capable or the highest ranking 100 people. The reality is it's an opportunity she can't turn down. More so than that, the factions of the natural order of things and the powers that be are at war with one another. And she basically says, like, if I decide to take this role, I will officially join their ranks. And in doing so, I will be immortal. Now for Wynn himself, he more or less is immortal. He's lived for 1,000 years. And so the idea that he has here in kind of a very cavalier, nonchalant way is to simply say, well, I mean, we can just lie, right? We can stay married and we can just lie because she's essentially his wife. They've been together for about 5 years or so, right? And he's like, we can just not tell anybody that we're staying together and we can make it look like we're going our separate ways. But she makes a really good point in saying the level of power that we're dealing with these gods that we serve, right? These incredibly powerful beings, they will find out. And when they do, they will destroy us. And as much as I love you, I'm not willing to die. And even Wynn himself says, but like I am. But ultimately she's made up her mind, right? And she's like, we need to get a divorce. We need to go our own separate ways. Once she realizes that Wynn refuses to do this, that his stance is like, you can send the papers over, but I'm never going to sign them. She does the only other thing she can do, which is kind of make a sort of physical declaration by shooting him in the head. Now, it's not going to kill him, right? I mean, it's not enough to actually kill him. It's really more her just kind of demonstrating to those individuals who may or may not be watching her, really to the gods of the natural order of things, she's officially ending things with him, right? That was 10 years ago. When all this happened with Wynn, that was 10 years ago. Now we jump to the present moment. And basically he travels to the Sanctum Sanctorum to visit Doctor Strange. Now, when he gets there, he's actually met by Wong instead of Stephen Strange. And when he asks where it is that he's at, the response of Wong is Stephen Strange is at the Library of Worlds where everybody else is. And even Wynn says, I hate this place. So one of the things that we're basically learning about the character of Wynn is that while he is a new introduction to us, this guy's been around the magical landscape for eons, and he's traveled seemingly everywhere that anybody can travel within the universe itself. As far as his experiences go, he seems to be on par with Doctor Strange, not so much in terms of power, but in terms of his knowledge and everything that he's seen, which for being 1,000 years old kind of makes sense. Now, as for the Library of Worlds, I love the Library of Worlds. It was one of the coolest things that Jonathan Hickman introduced in Avengers: The New Avengers. The idea behind the Library of Worlds is that it's a place that exists in the nexus of all creation. Going into the Library of Worlds, you can access any universe from this place. And for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Marvel Comics, there's a lot of places you can do that, right? The M'Kraan Crystal, somebody like Doctor Strange, you can just jump into different alternate realities or different dimensions or what have you. But the whole reason why he's called so many people here is because there's what's called a Babylon event taking place. Now, the Babylon event, we don't know anything about. This is, again, another new creation by Jonathan Hickman. We don't know exactly what it means, but we will find out. What I also want you guys to take note of is that there is a veritable who's who of the Marvel Universe that's here. For example, you see people from Advanced Idea Mechanics, but you also see Doctor Doom, the Scarlet Witch, Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. It's a coming together of the most capable scientific and magical minds within the Marvel Universe. And what Stephen Strange says here is that when he's asked by Clea, is there truly a Babylon event taking place? Of course, Clea being the one-time apprentice and even wife of Stephen Strange, and now she's just kind of a chick who's out there. He says, last night there was a bleed on the plains of Mercator, which is just an alternate dimension that exists out there. And he says, when I arrived, I found the Guardian twins blinded and the infernal glyph over which they stood sentinel stolen. I had to delve deep, but these were the last images burned into their minds. It appears to be the proto-mage Q.O.D.S core, long thought dead, who disappeared years ago. And what he says is that he seems to have returned more or less at the apex of his strength. But one thing is sure, he now has the staff of the living tribunal. But when people start asking the question, especially with Amadeus Cho, are we sure it's a Babylon event? I don't really see it. One of the things to know is that Amadeus Cho is one of the smartest people in the Marvel Universe. In fact, he's the 8th smartest person alive. And while Amadeus Cho has never been a person that seems to have been in any real capacity involved with Doctor Strange, what Jonathan Hickman is doing here is he's kind of introducing this Babylon event as something that anybody who is well-versed in science and magic knows about. It's a dreaded event, right? It represents the end times. And so again, it's new to us as the reader. They've known about it for quite some time. And so what we do is we're kind of introduced by way of Doctor Strange to a guy named Saint Mare Circle, right? The second centaur of the centum. Basically, he is among the top 100, right down from number 1. We don't know who would be in the number 1 spot, if it would be reserved for like the god of the natural order of things or what have you. But this guy basically tells them what Stephen Strange told you is accurate, but it's also a lot more dire than that. What he says is somewhere along the line, right, this guy, G.O.D.S core, had basically accessed an Advanced Idea Mechanics facility. And that's when we switch over to actually G.O.D.S core himself and like this explanation that he gives. And he says, when my God made the universe, he placed each of us inside a box. Of course, exclusively talking to this member of Advanced Idea Mechanics. And he says, many cannot see this box, the idea of it, the very shape of it, but the box is your home, and oh, how you hate it, right? And he says, you love the dream and hate the box, but what I tell you now is the truth, and it is the hardest truth you will ever hear. I am here to destroy the dream and wake you from your slumber. And so one of the things that he draws reference to, he says, you scientists and your curiosity, you drilled a hole in existence to mine for exotic matter and never asked the question, where do my actions lead? What do my actions feed? Now, here's the thing. There's two potentials on what this guy's talking about. The first is an event that transpired that we simply just haven't seen. The second, and the one that I'd be willing to bet my money on, is when they made a cosmic cube, because Advanced Idea Mechanics did create a cosmic cube. And as anybody who read Jonathan Hickman's Avengers: The New Avengers knows, cosmic cubes are the result of somebody drilling a hole or really creating a kind of portal in space and time and accessing the realm of the Beyonders. And so a cosmic cube is quite literally the power of a Beyonder confined in a cube shape. It's the reason why a cosmic cube is equally powerful to the Infinity Gauntlet. It is the ability to wield the energy and the power of beings that are nigh omnipotent, that were more than capable of annihilating every cosmic entity in existence. We don't definitively know if that's the case, but it would make sense that Jonathan Hickman has done that, and that what's happening here is the logical end result of the first time they did it. Now, again, we don't definitively know, right? We're just kind of left to guess in terms of what's happening here. But that's when everybody basically realizes, in the midst of all this, this guy begins to cast a spell. And that's when you switch over to guys like Jericho Drumm, Stephen Strange, where they ask, is this truly a spell that he's casting? Is he truly causing a Babylon event? And the response of Stephen Strange is, it's most likely true, yes. The real power of the staff of the Living Tribunal is that the user user and the staff can write a spell and rewrite reality in a continuum, leaving no room for a counterspell. So in effect, whatever spell he creates with the staff cannot be undone. That's the true ability of it. And that this would be a Babylon event, right? The end times, the ending of everything. Now, I'm sure Hickman will go into more detail in terms of what a Babylon event means on a greater scale and how far reaching it can be. But in the here and now, everybody here agrees they all need to act. They all have to respond in some capacity. And so in what seems like kind of a out of left field moment, Wynn and Dimitri end up back outside and then they pick up a penny. And the response of Wynn is like, it's a John Wilkes Booth penny. I bet we could trade this for something really good. And so what we do is we transition to the collector, and literally Wynn shows up here with a John Wilkes Booth penny and presents it to the collector. And the collector is totally enamored over it, but only for a particular reason. He says, it's from another Earth, lost in the great collapse, the now extinct, forgotten by all but a select few, brain 71241. You see, it should have been a dark mirror, but somehow was not. Perhaps it can be again. If I'm surmising here, assuming Hickman's not referencing some unseen event, he's referencing the collapse of the multiverse from Avengers and New Avengers, right? Like the ending of everything, because that's one of the things to remember, right? If you read Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, then you read Secret Wars 2015, then you read all the different comics that came in the aftermath of it, with the exception of Black Panther, who used the Time Stone when everything was being rewritten at the very end of Secret Wars. He used the Time Stone to jump back to the past before all of it happened, with the exception of him and maybe like a couple other people, that one guy from the Jessica Jones story who murdered his wife. Almost no one remembers that Secret Wars happened. Almost nobody remembers the collapse of the multiverse. Very few people do. The collector seems to be one of them. And so in this moment, what you also have is Dimitri, who picks up on a clock with 6 hands, who also, basically wants to trade for the clock. And then Wynn, who wants to trade for a book that has an eye on it. It's not the Darkhold. Before you guys get super excited, it's not the Darkhold. I thought it was, but it is actually going to be incredibly important to this story. And so at that point, we switch over to what's called the Contemplator's Garden. Now, the Contemplator is a very old character in Marvel Comics, and in fact, he's also one of the Elders of the Universe. But the Contemplator very much fancies himself a kind of Buddhist, right? Almost like a Buddha type character, where he focuses more on inner harmony, right? Yin and yang, that kind of thing. And I know I'm mixing like, religious and philosophical viewpoints here, but like, you get the point, right? Kind of finding basically balance within oneself. And so being presented a clock with 6 hands, he says 3 hands for perceived time and 3 hands for the axes of all things, the synchronicity of power, life, and purpose, all waxing and waning as if there was some grand design to it all. And so as thank you for the gift, he presents Wynn with 4 vials. And while he is very wordy here in saying that each one contains a precious gift, right? All variables are to be determined, all possibilities are in your hands, right? Grab one and remove all doubt. What he's basically saying here is that it's not something like a game show where it's like door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, right? Let me show you what's behind door number 3. And it totally changes the probabilities of whether or not the person will guess between doors 1 or 2. What this is designed to do is say, each one of these vials possesses something of astronomical value and worth, but they're all equal in their value and worth. So you can't choose wrong, right? That's essentially what he's saying here. And that in response to that, Wynn ends up grabbing one of the vials and then in turn brings it to the possessor. And that in bringing it to the possessor, he breaks the vault and inside of it is a key. And that this key serves the purpose of accessing a security vault, right? And so by presenting this key to the possessor then comes back with a box. And what he does is that in opening the box, it's essentially a translocator to get from point A to point B. And that where this all seems kind of really crazy in Cloak and Dagger, by using this translocator, it allows him to basically be transported to the Grand Bazaar of the Trader. And the Grand Bazaar of the Trader is exactly what you think it is, a guy who's willing to trade things for other things. And this particular instance, you end up having Wynn, who meets with Stephen Strange. Now, Stephen Strange was actually part of an event that was going on. We'll kind of jump back to that here in a second, because honestly, the comic jumps back and forth, and so it's kind of easier to cover this before we get to everything else. That what ended up happening is Stephen Strange had essentially bailed out, that everything else was just kind of a distraction, and that him, quote unquote, rallying the troops when he was in the Library of Worlds was a way to basically get them to focus on the immediate problem while he can focus on a more grand and solid solution. But what's happening here is Stephen Strange is actually bargaining for use of Eldrak. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what Eldrak is, Eldrak was at one point a human being. At least we believe he was a human being. But when he underwent the Terrigen Mist, and then his inhuman genes, also known as the useless genes in Marvel Comics, were essentially activated, he turned into a giant portal. And so, as a rare case in Marvel Comics, he's an Inhuman that actually serves a useful purpose. But the way that Eldrak works as a portal, it's really, really cool. He's not one of these guys where you just walk through a portal and just kind of go wherever you want to go, right? He's not like the Siege Perilous where you walk through and you start over again or anything along those lines. The way that Eldrak works is that when you pass through the portal, he sends you to where you need to go and sends you there at the precise moment that you're needed, right? So it's really, really cool in terms of how his teleportation system works. But what ends up happening is Stephen Strange basically barters with the trader, right? Presenting him with some trinkets and whatnot in order to use Eldrak right at the moment when Wynn and Dimitri arrive. And what Wynn does is he presents the trader with basically a translocator of Kree design that would allow him to get to anywhere that he wants to be. And where the trader just kind of initially dismisses it, the response of Wynn is, actually, I just came from the Possessor's vault. So you could use this thing and you could teleport yourself to the Possessor's vault. And who knows what kind of trinkets you could find in that place, right? And ultimately the bargain is made. And so what ends up happening is when Doctor Strange and Dimitri pass through the Eldrak portal to arrive precisely when they need to. Now, at this point, we jump back to the immediate aftermath when you had Stephen Strange calling all the forces together and saying, we have to find a way to stop this Babylon event. And so what you get is Black Panther, Reed Richards, Amadeus Cho in his Hulk form, Jericho Drum, also known as like Brother Voodoo. These guys all respawn, but they're fighting this battle on multiple fronts. More so than that, what this Babylon event basically seems to be is the unleashing of eldritch creatures, right? Eldritch demons onto the earthly plane, one of which looks like Cthulhu, right? So it quite literally is bringing about the end times. And that's why they all kind of begin to panic in that moment, because these are beings of astronomical power. And so the way this whole plan is orchestrated, those individuals from Earth, right? Reed Richards, T'Challa, Doctor Doom, Amadeus Cho, that they will basically focus on the Prometheus pit that's feeding the Eldritch gods and shut the pit down. Those individuals who are capable of magic on Earth, so people like Wong and so on and so forth, right, that they would focus on defending the rift against those Babylon creatures that are coming out, those eldritch monsters, and that the Centum, right, the natural order of things, those forces will deal with the Cubics core, right, this guy who's just incredibly powerful. The problem with this is they're all painfully outmatched, woefully outmatched in such a way to where there's seemingly no conceivable way for them to win. Even when you have Reed Richards talking to T'Challa, and these are the two, or at least two of the smartest people in the entirety of the Marvel Universe, they can really like shut this down in about an hour, but they don't have an hour. In an hour, they'll all be dead, right? They'll all be annihilated and destroyed. And like, that's gonna be it. And so even when those members of the natural order of things make their move against like Cubics core, he takes them all out in one fell swoop, because what he says is, my master assumed that your master would be the most offended and that he would send you here. Now, this kind of seems to be alluding to the idea of it just being a power play, right? Like, if anybody's going to take over the earth and wipe out everything on the planet, it's going to be me, right? Like that kind of a thing. Because the way that Hickman builds up the nature of the natural order of things and the powers that be, while they are astronomically powerful, they also seem very human and basic in nature. And so he had basically given Q.D.S. this kind of device that would allow him to take out the entirety of the forces of the natural order of things who were at bay. And pretty much all of them but Aiko are eradicated, right? They're all basically destroyed. And so in that moment, that's when Doctor Strange and Dimitri show up here at a moment when it feels like everything is lost. And while Wen is an avatar for the powers that be, right off the bat, we're kind of shown he's not all powerful. It's not like he rolls in here, snaps his fingers, and the day's saved. It's not that level of power, which I think is cool to make him a guy that's like comparable to Stephen Strange, but not like the Fulcrum or the One Above All or the Living Tribunal or something along those lines. And so what he ends up doing is he had basically told Dimitri at a previous point in time that the book that he possessed was a book of astronomical power, and it could not fall into the wrong hands. And so when he's attacked by the eldritch creatures, the book goes flying out of his grasp, right? And then immediately, like, Q.D.S. picks it up because Dimitri panics and says, "Wen, God's the book, right? You've dropped the book," and makes a huge fuss out of it. In turn, Q.D.S. comes to the realization this book must be something of significance. The guy goes to crack it open, he starts reading it, and then everything ends. Everything just stops, right? Just boom, done. And that's over with. And this guy's defeated, right? Now, here's the way in which it happens. And this is actually one of the coolest things. It's one of the coolest things the way that it's done, right? You have this conversation between Doctor Strange and Wen, where Stephen Strange talks about how he's just too old for this kind of thing, right? He's tired of dealing with this kind of stuff over and over and over again, which really seems to put off this idea that while even though Reed Richards and T'Challa and Amadeus Cho and those guys aren't normally involved with this kind of conflict, this kind of stuff happens all the time. Which, if you ever read Jason Aaron's run on Doctor Strange, you probably already know that, right? I mean, it's mind-boggling the kind of stuff that goes on in the background. But what Wen revealed here is that the book was never an ultra powerful book. It was never astronomically powerful. And even like Stephen Strange says, like, that was very clever using the Buchub book, right? Because the nature of this book, as it's explained, is that the longer you read it, the more it eats your mind. And once you start, you simply can't break free. And so in effect, when that guy cracked the book open, it started consuming all the knowledge in his head. And basically there was no way for him to keep the portal open. He didn't know how to continue conjuring magic to make sure that he could stay on top. That was essentially it. Now, of course, you end up having the book that's basically taken, right? And that's effectively it, right? Wen just kind of walks away with it. But it is kind of a cool moment because there's this bit of a discussion, right? Where they kind of go back and forth for a moment. And it's one of those things where Stephen Strange says, like, you know, I fight for the light and for causes better than I and for fate based in forever and her sisters, hope and life and so on and so forth. That is who I am. When he says things like that, he's speaking literally, right? Like the cosmic entities, abstract beings that exist out there, he fights on their side. And while Wen calls him out in a very John Constantine kind of way, like, yeah, that's really cool, it's a nice speech and everything, you know, but here's the question, right? Like, are you a good guy or are you a bad guy? And the response of Stephen is, I'm good. And then he asks Wen, are you good or are you evil? And the response of Wen is, who can tell the difference anymore? Like, I've seen it all, right? Like, I've seen everything that's out there, right? And he even looks at this idea of like the powers that be and the natural order of things as just these beings that don't really care about right and wrong, good or evil anymore. They just want to keep waging war against one another. This is basically alluding to the idea that there is a desire to destroy these cosmic beings that are out there, these beings of astronomical power. That seems to be the goal of Wen. Whether or not that will actually happen, I don't fully know, but I am excited to see how it plays out because basically, you know, Aiko runs up on him and she kisses him, says, thanks for saving us, you know, and then that's basically it. But I'm excited to see where this goes, man. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section about this comic, and I will catch you all later. Peace.